coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung, Earthlets, and welcome to the latest episode of the 2000 AD Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. And I, as always, am your host, Molch-R. Welcome to another episode where we've got both an interview and a panel. Now, the interview is with somebody who's made a bit of a splash at the galaxy's greatest comic over the last couple of years, and that's Kenneth Niemand, who's a writer who's worked on Judge Dredd. The new series, Megatropolis, with Dave Taylor, has started in the Judge Dredd Megazine. So it was absolutely fantastic to get him on the line. Not somebody who's particularly keen on interviews, it has to be said. So there was a bit of negotiation there, and then we were absolutely beset by technical issues throughout. So it's an audio only interview, and thanks very much Zoom for really screwing that one up. So going to be chatting to him about his background, how he came to be working for 2000 AD, and his ideas on Dredd, what Megatropolis is about, etc, etc. Then we've got the full panel from the New York Comic Con Metaverse event. Now, this was the other day. The panels had to be under half an hour long. And after we'd finished recording this panel, it was it was over an hour. So, some pretty radical editing had to happen, but they've given us permission to run the entire thing on the podcast, which is excellent. So it was myself, Evan Narcisse, Chloe Maveal, Kelly Kanayama, and Arthur Wyatt talking about Judge Dredd and satire in the year 2020 with everything that's been going on both in the States and in the UK. Attitudes towards policing, difference between America and Britain, and what Judge Dredd says about that, and how he has, as a character, tracked changes in attitudes and events towards and of policing. So that was an absolutely fascinating discussion about quite a controversial topic over the last few years, but especially in the last 6 months during lockdown. As always, thank you very much indeed for all the lovely feedback we've been getting on the lockdown tapes. If you want to get in touch, thrillcast at 2000ad.com. That's thrillcast, all one word, at 2000ad.com. Do give us a share and a like on Facebook and Twitter, and on the reviews on the podcast of your choice if you're enjoying the lockdown tapes. We've got more interviews coming up in the future with creators past and present. Just need to crack on with organising those, actually. So, without much further ado, let's have a chat with Kenneth Niemand, a writer on Judge Dredd and Megatropolis. It's great to be able to welcome for the first time onto the podcast Kenneth Niemand, who's the writer on Judge Dredd and more recently Megatropolis, which is just started in the Judge Dredd Megazine. Kenneth, when your name appeared in 2000 AD, it fueled lots of speculation that it is a pseudonym. So do you want to tell us a little bit about how you came to 2000 AD, particularly considering that when I asked through the Mighty Tharg if you wanted to talk on the podcast, you're not keen on interviews, are you?
No, I'm not. I don't really like them. Even less sort of listening back to myself as well. It's awful. It's my name. It's a pseudonym. It's it's a lie. I do quite a bit of work in other media, radio stuff, video games writing, and it just for me it keeps my comic work separate from that. And it's and it's a handy tax dodge. It's not. I think maybe one or two other 2000 AD writers, and they gave me the intro to Tharg, and I proved my old grognard qualifications with that one-off story about Star-Lord, and that was it really.
I mean, it's interesting how quickly you've become one of the regular writers on Dredd, because normally a lot of people think of it as, you need to serve an apprenticeship and go through that process. But more recently, I think Tharg has been Marg. That's Tharg's sister. Tharg has been a lot better at identifying writers, got a strong voice. And each writer has their own take on Dredd and his wider world. So, what's your take on Dredd?
As much as I love the strip, I think my feelings on Dredd are always a bit mixed. I mean, he makes perfect sense in his world, as long as the parameters of that world are incredibly controlled, by narrative concerns. I mean, that old story where everyone in Mega City got a vote on whether the judges should continue in power, and most of them conveniently voted to go with the status quo, so the strip could keep running as it is. I mean, did they did they forget the Cal regime where they were all sentenced to death, or the Necropolis story where the judges are also mind controlled stooges of a genocidal force? But yeah, I mean, mega chumps, you keep on supporting the boot on your throat.
I mean, there's a wider discussion to be had about that regarding memory within the strip and time passing. But you definitely, I mean, following on from that, you definitely seem to focus more on the city and its citizens, which is something that writers such as Cy Spurrier, Al Ewing have mentioned being their focus too. So does this free you up to tell the kind of stories that you can't with Dredd himself? Because thinking back to the early days of the strip, in the light of mad characters such as Otto Sump and the Simps and all this and the other, how do you tease out human stories from a populace that doesn't retread the old ground that Wagner and Grant were innovating with in the 1980s?
Well, to be honest, I was a bit fed up reading stories about because of conspiracies inside the Justice Department, or where all the characters or all of the characters are wearing judge helmets. So I wanted to get back to stories about Dredd and the ordinary citizens, or maybe not even Dredd, maybe just sometimes just the ordinary citizens. There's a trope that you can fall into there, though, where Dredd just sort of becomes a guest star in his own strip, just turning up at the end to shoot or arrest the story's real subject. And hopefully that's what I avoid. I manage not to kind of fall into that one too much.
But let's move on to talk about Noam Chimpsky, which is a kind of doesn't fall into that trap, but is part of the kind of thing of ordinary citizens as stars, though you wouldn't necessarily call a kind of teenage chimp an ordinary citizen. So I mean, the strip has a long history of kind of these simian supporting characters that are usually portrayed as mobsters or idiots. So what's Noam's origin story, and why did you decide him to make him an ape?
He came out of a discussion with Paul Holden, actually, and another writer. In fact, I think it was the other writer who came up with the name, which really made the character come to life. So me and him, had a quick literary knife fight, and I ended up winning with the right to use Noam. I think I originally imagined him looking a bit more fuddy-duddy, tweed jackets, glasses, whatever. But Paul's character design kind of changed it a bit, and it was when he gave him a sling weapon that we realised he'd be a lot more hands-on, going out on vigilante missions and using non-lethal ways to fight bad guys. But being an ape, him being an ape, is probably the least important thing I'd say about him. I mean, it's obviously memorable, but it's the least important thing. He's incredibly smart, very smart Sith who sees all the things wrong with the world around him and decides he needs to try and change what he can to fix them.
I mean, it's a character that has a lot of resonance for the way the world is at the moment, and I guess the comparisons with a character like Chopper kind of crop up immediately when you think about a teenage rebel out to outwit Dredd. But I do sense there's something slightly different in your portrayal of Noam. How has this idea evolved as you've written him, or I mean, you've already talked a little bit about the evolution of the character, but was this your intention from the start that he would be a character a bit like Chopper?
It's maybe weird, but I think the character he's probably most like is early PJ Maybe, except
Okay.
yeah, obviously one is an evil psychopathic kid, and the other is more a sort of a generous altruist who wants to make his world a better place. But I think they both manage to stay off Dredd's radar and generally get the better of him without him really knowing that they even exist. But I mean, yeah, someone has. I've seen a message on them on Twitter saying that they'd been waiting decades for a character like Noam to come along, and it's great. It's great for Dredd to have a very heroic antagonist again. So I can see the Chopper comparison, absolutely. I mean, is his name a simple pun? Does it say something maybe sort of deeper about in character with Noam? I think it's just the kind of the perfect name, I think, for a really smart kind of altruistic ape who easily sees the true nature, the real nature of the judge system. So yeah, I mean, I think his whole character is kind of in that name. It's a great introduction to understanding him almost immediately. I mean, thank God I did win that knife fight and made it mine. I actually, I did briefly interview Chomsky years and years ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was trying to do what you do and be like a real journalist. He was he's very polite and patient, but also kind of terrifyingly intelligent. I wouldn't like to know. I mean, I shudder to think what he'd make of Noam Chimpsky now.
I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that Noam has been a breakout character, and these don't come around very often in Dredd because Dredd tends to shoot his adversaries, but as you say, Noam stays under Dredd's radar. He's able to not pop up as an immediate threat, so Dredd isn't necessarily out to shoot it. I mean, did you expect the character to be popular, and where does he go from this point?
I think we knew he was a strong idea for a character. I knew he was a strong lead, but not anything like the popularity that is achieved at the moment. I think I knew he was good. Matt, the editor, took a little bit more convincing, but okayed a one-off Dredd story with him, which got obviously that immediate huge reaction from people, which was really nice to see. And after that, it was like, right, well, sold. When can you do another Chimpsky stories? And there's two more Dredd stories featuring him in the works, and then he's getting his own solo story where he doesn't have to always get the better of Dredd to keep the narrative going. That's sometime next year, and this first story is is called the Talented Mr. Chimpsky. It'll be fun. I hope a sort of an Agatha Christie whodunit, but in space, where Noam has to save the horrible members of a family whose wealth comes from the exploitation of all of the first generations of intelligent apes.
We've had a recent panel for New York Comic Con about what a character like Dredd means right now when you're seeing an awful lot of disorder in the States and questions of policing are coming up. And with these issues of police brutality, law and order, and justice being in the news more than ever, what are your own feelings on Dredd?
I think it's noticeable that the recurring enemies that Dredd goes up against are, for the most part, kind of just a way worse versions of him. The Sovs, the Dark Judges, all those even more authoritarian conspiracies inside the judge system. It's like, it's a bit of a Nazi, but these other guys are like way worse Nazis. So thank goodness the lesser Nazis up there to stop them. And kind of that's the contradiction, I think, that generations of Dredd writers have been trying to deal with. Pat Mills made him a hero in The Cursed Earth. Alan Grant made him an out-and-out fascist, I think, in his later stories. And obviously, I think I lean more toward the Alan Grant side of things, the Alan Grant model, but the real world, I think, is a horrible enough place at the moment. So I wanted just to show that there's a little bit of hope in the grim, dark dystopia, hence Noam, and the focus, I think, more on lives of the city's people.
Megatropolis has started in the Judge Dredd Megazine, and this is something a bit different, and we've seen some really good responses to this. What can you tell us about the strip's genesis?
It all came from a picture on social media of a motorbike, and I'm not kidding. You can Google it. It's a really famous classic kind of bike. It's a Henderson Streamliner from the 1930s, and it's beautiful. It's Art Deco gorgeousness. It's an Art Deco Lawmaster, which got me thinking about what kind of a retro future world would produce that bike. And of course, the go-to film of retro future is Metropolis. So Metropolis, mega city, put them together, Megatropolis, boom, and that's the whole thing fell into place kind of really, really, really quickly after that.
It's a strip that's pretty much got a single continuity. Dredd hasn't really done the Elseworld style series before, unless it's been playing around with its own continuity, its own setting. But why is that? Do you think? Why haven't there been multiple different versions of Dredd?
Was there maybe some special in the 90s that was about reimagining Dredd characters as Elseworld things? Like, was there samurai or knights or stuff? I mean, it was the 90s.
It was the Alternity Special, I think it was.
Yeah. I mean, I can't really say why that's not been done like that before. I mean, once it kind of occurred to me, it kind of seemed really, really obvious. Like that setting just seems right. Steampunk, Victorian, Britain, mega city, something like that. Just doesn't sound like it's going to work.
So, and why did you decide to reimagine Dread's aside from the obvious inspiration of that motorcycle?
Well, I mean, like I said, once the idea came, it just kind of pours out, which is just usually a good sign you're onto something worthwhile. Except when it isn't. I mean, it was kind of, imagine someone trying to create a utopian super science society, but it all went badly wrong because of human nature. I mean, now what happens after that? What happens when someone tries to fix it by introducing Dredd, judge, jury, executioner, justice into that failing world?
And what was Stan's reaction to this?
He loved it. Like immediate commission. I wish all jobs were like that.
Fritz Lang's Metropolis movie, as you say, clearly an inspiration, but there's themes of police corruption in there. So do I also detect like some an allusion to like classic gumshoe fiction, like Raymond, like hardball stuff like Raymond Chandler?
Well, that's the motherlode, isn't it? Joe Rico. Ooh, there's a name that should send Dredd fans heads spinning. It's basically the guy from that Chandler quote. Down those mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean. He's a straight arrow in a grimy, corrupt police department. I mean, the main thing I read when I was writing it, though, was James Elroy. I mean, to pick up on the way that he writes dialogue from the 40s and the whole corruption in high and low places that he does really well. I mean, I kind of ignored his personal trope of making even his protagonists a bit screwed up and messed up with a kind of a head full of bad wiring.
Dave Taylor's done fantastic work on the series. I mean, it's genuinely beautiful. You know, when we put out the splash page on our social media, like the immediate reaction. How important are aesthetics to a series like this in relation to sort of creating mood and scene setting and things like that?
I mean, Dave and I talked a lot early on about the look of the world and what bits of technology are and then aren't sort of like Megatropolis appropriate.
And is this the beginning of something new? I mean, are there other ways you'd like to imagine Dredd?
Yeah, well, there'll be more Megatropolis, hopefully. the first series is kind of really the start of a bigger story. We've got Megatropolis, Judge Anderson in there, dropping kind of prophecy bombs about mad shit to come. So yeah, there's a plan. But I mean, I'm not really kind of that person who's going to pitch 17 ideas along like the same lines. You know, it's like, it's Judge Dredd, but I don't know, but in an 18th century revolutionary Paris where they fly around in hot air balloons. I mean, you could go on and on and on with that stuff.
Just talking about the future, what sort of stuff have you got coming in the pipeline? Because you've got quite a bit that's run recently that's coming up, haven't you?
What kind of right now?
Yeah.
There's let me think. There's more Dredd. There's more Chimpsky. Paul Holden and I are doing the Dredd for this year's Christmas issue, which is a nice feather in the cap. There's a Chimpsky story called Three Kings that hopefully has a decent seasonal vibe to it. I've been waiting for Megatropolis to properly start really before thinking about more of it. So, which I am doing. So that I'm thinking about it. So that'll probably be something that's happening, soon. There's a six-part Dredd story called A Penitent Man that I'm looking forward to seeing. It's with Tom Foster, whose work looks really, really amazing, and it's about what happens when a disgraced ex-judge returns to the city after serving his 20 years on Titan. And Dredd's reaction is obviously completely predictable. All Titan judges are, of course, irredeemably bad. But in this case, the point of the story then is what happens then if that's not necessarily true.
Well, super. Thank you very much indeed to Kenneth for taking the time. Had an absolute dilly of a pickle with the technical issues on that one, so glad it came out all right in the end. So moving on to the New York Comic Con Metaverse panel with Evan Narcisse, Chloe Maveal, Kelly Kanayama and Arthur Wyatt, which is Judge Dredd, Satire and Policing in 2020. So welcome to the 2000 AD panel for New York Comic Con's latest online event. This is the Judge Dredd Policing and Satire in 2020 panel. And I've got a lineup of 4 great guests. First off, my name is Mike Molch-R. I'm the PR guy for 2000 AD and also a writer about Judge Dredd. And I'm joined by Chloe Maveal, who is a writer and critic who has written about Judge Dredd in 2000 AD. I'm also joined by Evan Narcisse, who is a comic book writer and critic, who has, we'll talk about how we've discussed Judge Dredd in the past in a moment. Kelly Kanayama is another critic, comic book critic, who writes about Garth Ennis, predominantly at the moment, but also has written about Judge Dredd. And Judge Dredd writer Arthur Wyatt, who is one of the 2 writers behind the current 2000 AD Judge Dredd story, Carry the 9, which touches on some real world issues, which we'll talk about in a moment. So welcome, everybody. As I mentioned in our little preamble before we started recording, Judge Dredd is one of those characters that is being evoked a lot at the moment. As we see events unfold in the US and in the UK, the issue of authority, of law and order, and of policing has never really been as divisive, as inflammatory, and as central to our understanding of what's happening in the world as it is at the moment. So I kind of wanted, in a free-form discussion, I wanted to get your views on whether Judge Dredd as a character can talk about this moment without it necessarily being flippant or trite. Whether a character like that can have a depth of importance in a historical moment like this, and what people's reactions to a character like Dredd say about our own attitudes towards law and order and policing, and particularly when you have a divide
between the way that police were created and are viewed in Britain, and the way that they were created and viewed in America, and what the character says about the differing attitudes between those two. Chloe, I want to come to you first because you recently wrote a piece about Judge Dredd and what's happening, particularly or has been happening in Portland over the last few months. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your feelings on this subject and what you think Dredd can say as a character in this day and age?
Oh boy, I got a lot of feelings about it. If anybody who's turned on the news has seen for the past 6 months, there have been the protests here in Portland, which is where I live. And right around that time was when I started rereading the Revolution storyline for Judge Dredd, where it's essentially people pushing back, people of Mega Scene 1 trying to push back for democracy. And they start rioting in the streets, and you see picket signs and all this stuff and chanting, and it's entirely peaceful. And the Justice Department is kind of working back alleys to try and make sure that get cut short, but also make the people feel like they can be heard. And I was just like, oh shit, this is not a good time. And in that sense, going back and rereading all of these stories that have happened 20, 30, 40 years ago, and it being just so true to what there is now, I think that Dredd has become this thing where everybody knows that it's a warning sign. The warning sign of fascism is if you start looking like Judge Dredd, maybe, just maybe, you are a fascist. But it's becoming more and more relevant. And the more stories you read, the more you're like, okay, so this is the basis of what we can really be looking at right now. And it's definitely made reading more interesting in that sense.
It's that visual imagery. It's that imagery of Dredd in his uniform, with the pads, the idea of militarization of the police that really seems to have struck a chord over the last few months as people start to see in.
That's because the guys that are out there look exactly like that.
I think too, Mike. One of the scary things about the proximity that Chloe's talking about, right, between that fiction and this reality, is that in the comics, Dredd essentially has impunity, right? There has to be a high council, review board whenever he crosses the line, but that's a rare thing, right? Dredd can pretty much do what he wants when he wants because, quote unquote, I am the law, right? And I think that's what how many police officers want to operate and indeed, already do operate that way. They have sole authority to, determine whether someone can walk away from an interaction or not, and if they make the call to kill that person, they then want, to suffer no consequences, and the thing that about Dredd that's so wild is that in the 80s, when this character was really becoming globally popular, this all seemed so far off, and that wasn't so long ago. And now we see, members of the press, elected officials being gassed and brutalized by American police. So what Chloe's saying is true, is that the Dredd always represented a future you never want to find yourself in, and we are, I think, perilously close.
There's always that element, and it's been interesting to see this play out over the last few months of justification. So there's an incredible moment in in Revolution, where Chief Judge Silver says to Dredd, "On this, you write the law," which is very much an appeal to the notion of the judges are not justice; they're the maintenance of order. They're instant retribution for people stepping over the line, and so it's horrifying to see that notion play out in kind of real time. You know, you have elected officials and commentators excusing brutality, heavy-handed policing,
Murder.
With the excuse of, well, they stepped out of line, they shouldn't have been doing what they were doing. Do you think that is a line that has been crossed in the American consciousness over the last few years?
I would say it. Just for me, I would say it's that line is just being more and more people are drawing it, or going over it with their own pencils or what have you. I think that's always been, in terms of the preservation of law and order, that's always been an issue. It's just who speaks out against it, who is affected by it. And now people are saying, yes, this is really bad because other members of these institutions that we see as preserving law and order are getting targeted or are getting attacked or injured or murdered, what have you, by the police. But where was this outrage? Not that it didn't exist, but where was this outrage in the 50s, in the 60s? Where was this outrage in the 1940s when American citizens were getting pulled out of their houses and shipped off to internment camps, losing their property, losing everything they had because they happened to be a particular race?
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing now is more and more people are speaking up. And so now there's a lot of pushback from the people who want to justify it. And, it keeps escalating because for the police, there seems to be where is the cap to preserve law and order? If your job is to preserve law and order, then anyone who speaks out against you is against law and order, right? But now that there's so many people speaking out, this is something possibly that nobody really planned for. And so I think that's part of why we see what we're seeing now.
I mean, there's definitely deep historical roots. I think it's not an accident that Dredd gets very associated with like the 80s, and a lot of these trends in policing kind of started in the 80s. I mean, I think a lot of them started with the sort of pushback against the civil rights movement, but you also saw the increasing militarization take off in the 80s. The sort of gang policing, I think, kind of happened in the 80s and early 90s, and it all sort of pushed police from the sort of officer-friendly types towards this sort of very militarized and separate from the civilian population version of police. There's also been attempts at reform, which usually end up in basically a bunch of funding for special training. And the special training actually all ends up making them more Judge Dredd-like. It all goes into, things like, situational response training that tends to push them towards an instant deadly response to any infraction. More equipment, more riot equipment, this whole very build-up armored look that's been creeping up on us over time. I think a lot of that does actually date back to the 80s. in the UK, I think, you know, it was probably more the riots we had then and the miners' strikes and onwards. There was a lot of social unrest, so you would see police out in this gear, but really, it's happened globally.
I mean, that's an interesting thing to ponder. That and that divide between what a policeman in Britain is and what a policeman in America is, and how they are viewed and where their sense of authority comes from. Because in Britain, we have what's called the Peelian principles. Now, these are very much hammered into new recruits during their initial training, which is the notion of community policing. That when you're a policeman, you are part of a community, and there is a kind of social contract going on there. You know, you are protecting them, but in return, you must behave in a certain way. And since from the 1970s onwards, the increase in, as Arthur says, situational responses, so riot cops, you know, cops for dealing with specific issues, has strained that. I'm interested in the American perspective on this, because, of course, in America, the history of the police is not the same as in Britain.
It's different.
It's very different.
Did America have thief takers? I feel like I should know this, but I super don't. So I learned about
Pinkertons.
this. Sorry?
We had Pinkertons. I mean,
yeah, that's different though. They were like, I mean, thief takers sort of like, you know, in the 18th century London, where you had these guys who would basically, policing was a for-profit business, where basically before they had the police as we know them, you know, you had these guys, or you had these guys, or these groups of guys who would basically, like, the more thieves you bring in, the more you get paid. You turn a thief in to the magistrate or whoever, and you get paid. But then, of course, there's more incentive to find more thieves, and so what would actually happen is these guys would the biggest one, I think, Jonathan Wild, which is a great name. He basically ran a crime ring, and he would get, like, so he made money off of the thieves, who would basically either inform on other ones, or they would steal something, and then they would pin it on a thief from a different gang. And that was kind of how it kept going. He went down in the end, but I mean, he was basically London's police, the closest thing London had to a chief of police for a little while there. So I was just wondering, like, people who actually paid attention in American history, did America have anything like that, or like, what did we have?
Well,
before the police.
You know, it's funny. I think there was probably some kind of civil, sometimes private and for-profit, you know, collections of people, probably mostly men, that were, you know, tasked to handle, like, legal disputes, right? Like interpersonal disputes. But you know, I think something that's becoming really prevalent in political conversation in America nowadays is thinking about how in a lot of parts of the country, a more organized system of like crime, what's the word I'm looking for? Averting crime came from slave patrols. You know, like in the 19th century, you know, it was very common, obviously, for people who owned enslaved people to want their property back, the people that they saw as their property back, and people were empowered to cross state lines and retrieve that, you know. And I think that infrastructure, especially in southern states, led to the kind of formal organization of police as we know it today. It's one step in the evolution, right? And I think an important one. And when you think about how modern day policing does reinforce class divides, you know, and racial divides, like it makes sense. And what Arthur was saying before is really important, because police are always deployed in an us versus them situation, right? And what you were saying, Michael, before about community policing, that's a concept we don't see a lot of in the United States, actually. You know, like when I was growing up in New York City, and police reform was constantly being discussed, like in the late 80s and the early 90s. One of the things that was brought up was a lot of cops don't live in the areas where they work. You know, like a cop who might work in Brooklyn or Harlem could live in Staten Island, you know, or lives like up in the Bronx, you know, is not part of the community, doesn't know the people there, doesn't know situations there. So that makes them a lot easier, makes it a lot easier for them to kind of regress to stereotype when thinking about the people they interact with, right? And when you bring it back to somebody like Dredd, you know, like to Dredd, like compassion is like a way down in his traits. You know, Arthur, correct me if I'm wrong, but like I feel, yeah, and I feel
it's
like
there, but a lot on top.
Right. And the thing, you know, if you think about the hierarchy of needs for Dredd, it's like doing the job above all else. And I feel like, again, that's what most cops seem to be operating off of, the same hierarchy. And, you know, what's really scary, you think about the name of this panel, is like the distance between satire and reality now is like super, super small. And it almost feels like we're past the cautionary tale aspect of it all. And like it feels like we're living in a really frightening fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the differences that, well, at least on paper, between Judge Dredd and both America and Britain is that in America and Britain, there are other branches of government. There's Parliament, there's Congress. I was going to say there's the president, but no. You know, in other circumstances, there was the president. And they theoretically could work for or against, with or in contrast to the cause. And in Judge Dredd, I mean, there's a mayor, but they haven't had a really good track record there. The most popular ones they've ever had were the orangutan and the serial killer. So, serial killer and identity thief. So, when we talk about reform, you know, in Judge Dredd, that would be just a completely different thing, because there's no one else.
Yeah, and
they are the law.
Right.
Because there's nothing else.
The funny thing about Dredd is that, you know, one of the things that makes you accept the authoritarian kind of framing of that fiction is that, like, the world's on the brink, right? Like, this is post-nuclear apocalypse, you know, like humanity really is like on the wane, right? You know, but it makes it easier to understand that there might need to be some kind of expedited legislative, you know, process, right? Or a non-existent one. We really don't see a legislative process in Dredd comics. The problem is, you know, it feels like, again, we're trending towards that in the United States, where, like, you know, any kind of legislative conversation about how to better reapportion funds or reform the way the job is done, like the people don't even want to have that discussion. You know, they just want you know, I think the people who support cops like blindly just want them to be able to do their job out there and lean back on the training that they get without even really knowing what it is or what measures go into place to like help keep it more humane. So yeah, the idea that like is just enforcement that's untethered to like a community or any kind of legislative oversight is frightening.
Well, it's funny with the idea of there being checks and balances in the Judge Dredd universe, because kind of part of the whole idea of how the judges got started is in the direction of, power to the people, community policing, all this stuff. Well, we tried that with them one time and we saw how that turned out. So every time there's kind of a push for these checks and balances and for something to be put in place where there is more power to the people and there is more fairness and leniency when it comes to lawmaking, that just means, we're going to go back to how it was before. And we didn't like that because it didn't meet our values. So we need to push into this harder. So it ends up coming kind of full circle and then doubling back even again for more. So the more freedom you try to get within this universe, the harder the strap's going to come down.
That's a really interesting point about that we've come to, which is about binary choices. And when things started to go awry this year in America, Donald Trump tweeted repeatedly, law and order. So by saying that, you're immediately saying, well, I am for law and order, so therefore, by a process of elimination, everybody else, if they are not for me, is for chaos. And you see that talk in the judges. In fact, in Britain, you see it go all the way back to before Margaret Thatcher came into power, because people often think of Dredd as a parody of Thatcherism, but the process was well underway by the time she came to power. That notion of either you stand square for law and order, or you are for the chaos we see around us. And Arthur and Kelly, as people with experience of Britain and the politics of Britain, people can often get caught up in Dredd being a parody of America, when of course it's not. It's a parody of Britain that uses America and the American way of thinking of parodying Britain. I mean, what's your take on how he has worked out as a parody of this country?
Arthur, I'm gonna let you start this one. You grew up here.
I would say it's kind of a mix of things that Dredd is. I mean, the nature of Dredd is very ephemeral in that it can be a parody of the UK, can parody US events. It more likely parodies US media portrayal of events or US media. The whole thing is, if you trace it back, kind of a riff on Dirty Harry. So via Dirty Harry to One-Eyed Jack to Dredd, there's kind of a causal chain of what this thing is, and the idea was to do tough policing, which I think was kind of an American thing. I think some of the things that are included and not included are kind of tells about it being British, and it's got a kind of class consciousness that you would not really see in American work usually. It more or less completely ignores race, which I don't think that would really be possible in a US work. If it was possible, then I'm not sure it would really be excusable. Kind of gets away with it by dint of being British and that being less of a factor in policing. So, Lord knows it's not a non-factor.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, it's less of a factor in the media version of policing at any rate.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I feel like I cut you off.
Right, I sort of ran out of a
okay.
things to say. I'm free-forming here.
We all are. Yeah, I think like America is, going back to the sort of beginning of Judge Dredd, or the beginning of the 2000 AD is, let's take from things from Hollywood, from from film, from TV, because these things are corrupting the, you know, the guardians of culture at that time. They think, oh, these things are corrupting the youth. This creeping Americanism is undermining good British values. And so they went, undermining good British values? That sounds like something we could do. And that's why, you know, all of this stuff is American, because early 2000 AD also has strips like Harlem Heroes, which is, it's a sports comic, but instead of the good working class lad, but who is accepted by the upper class because he's just so good at football or running, the two sports that there are. Instead of that, it's Black American guys who play this super dangerous future sport. And
Jetpack soccer.
yes, jetpack soccer. Sorry, aeroball, but you know, jetpack soccer. And you know, comics like that is also, I think, where Dredd comes out of, where the part of the reason it's in America is, well, you can get away with more stuff, I think, if you say, oh, no, see, we're not saying this is what Britain is like. See, it takes place in America, so we're saying America is bad, so please let's keep publishing our comic. I think it's also that America was sort of cool and a little bit dangerous, and you know, you give kids, because this used to be in a comic for kids. Adults read it too, but you know, it was aimed at children. And so I think the satire was often painted in much broader strokes so that children could get something out of it, even if they didn't understand that it was satire. So I think that's part of why it just gets so associated with America, because yeah, Dredd has always been about Britain, but it's always been taken America on as this sort of cover for what it's, partially as a cover, but partially as, that is part of its mission almost, to be subversive. And at the time, one of the ways to do that was, you know, sticking two fingers up to the guardians of culture and saying, screw you, we're going to set this all in America, and it's going to be violent, and it's going to have guns, and we're going to say that you know, future police are super violent, and that we're heading to in the future you're allowed to just shoot people for littering if you're a cop, because that's legal. It's the law. Legally, you are allowed to do that. So yeah.
America, crazy, right?
Yeah. Don't look over there at the cops beating up the miners. And that's miners with an E, or it could be with an O. I don't know how old the people working in the mines were.
Thinking about now, because the kind of roots of Dredd are fascinating, and probably an entire episode panel in their own right. Can Dredd, picking up on a comment that Evan made earlier about we're kind of past the point of this being a warning, can Dredd still be relevant now, do we think?
It can horribly be relevant when you're writing it. That's the bit you don't like, is when you're writing something and it suddenly turns out relevant on your local TV screen. Recently, so you mentioned Carry the Nine that I'm doing with Rob at the moment. There's actually quite a lead time on comics, so that we came up with, I want to say about 20 weeks ago, just before End of Days started running anyway, just when things started really kicking off in cities across the US. And we basically had just been sort of tossing back and forth ideas of what to do with this character, Judge Maitland, who's an accountant. And that just seemed like a funny hook for a story. And then there's this sort of big mega event that's happening in the comic that trashes the city a little. So it's like, okay, we'll do something like that. And then we're like, okay, so we'll put some looting in, and maybe there's a trash sector house. So we've got a police station that's in danger of being looted. all of this kind of coalesced just before a whole bunch of people started going on the street, and then there was some looting, and the police station got trashed, and that really kind of that kind of spiked me, and I think Rob a little, to put a little more into that story and really sort of push some aspects of it. The accounting thing, that's the thing that ended up being super interesting, because I was not, prior to this story, I was not sort of super up on the defund the police or divest and reinvest movement. That ended up being a huge deal here. Particularly, I'm based in Seattle, where we've recently defunded the police by 5% after a lot of back and forth and struggle. So yeah, I've kind of been radicalized by the police actions in Seattle a little, to seeing that as a thing to pursue, and here I got this comic about the accountancy of policing and sort of reducing spending and investing in other areas to basically reverse the course of police militarization. So I kind of ended up with, me and Rob both kind of ended up with a story that's like super relevant almost by accident. And in a way, that feels better than like trying to actually chase whatever is happening now. And I think you more and more just end up colliding with these things. If you're thinking about policing at all, I think, and you write the thing thinking about policing, which I think is the only ethical way to do it, then you're gonna collide with this sort of thing more and more.
I imagine it ends up being more like an accident. I mean, even just even more recent versions of Dredd, up to and including Carry the Nine. But thinking back to even 2015, Wagner did a story called The Beating, and it was like Dredd straight up like kicks the shit out of this guy who's like kind of playfully taunting him, and they have to play it off to the media like it was a mistake. And there's a whole conversation between Dredd and Hershey that is him like, yeah, sure, I know I made a lapse in judgment, but can you make this disappear? She's like, I know what to say, it's okay. And she plays it off. So it's just like, oh my God, but and I realized that was 5 years ago, but at the same time it's like, you accidentally ran into this situation, didn't you, John? Like, it just kind of fits in. And I think that's the fortunately unfortunate part of Dredd, is you're going to, the way that policing is, particularly in America, and the way it's continuing to head right now, Dredd is going to be something relevant no matter which way the story goes. And that's both terrifying and, well, no, it's just terrifying. Like, that's it.
Yeah. And sort of even more terrifying, that story is sort of played as rare and out of character.
Yeah.
Because Dredd, the other big difference with Dredd is, Dredd is brought up isolated from society, which somehow makes him completely incorruptible and completely dedicated to the law, whatever that is. Instead of, the situation where cops are isolated from community breeds contempt for them, which seems to be what we get.
It's funny about what you were saying, Chloe. It's really interesting because in the name of the panel brought this up for me, is that like the ability to endure satire, to even participate in it, like seems to be something that's totally missing on the part of like police loyalists, right? And it's something that you see in a character like Dredd, right? Like, don't you dare like make fun of Joe, like he'll fuck you up, like he'll beat your ass, because it demands like respect over everything else, right? It demands submission. and fealty, right? Like
Mhm.
there's no room to even make fun of his sneer or anything else about him. And I feel like you're getting to the same point of like oath swearing allegiances to the police as an institution in the United States. Either you're with us or against us, and
Mhm.
you have Blue Lives Matter movement, all that kind of stuff. You're busting to speak.
I am.
Go ahead.
But also when you said Blue Lives Matter, just had a little.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, no, I was gonna say that with with everything that's already been said, which I think makes some really excellent points. There is the question of what is policing within society, and unlike the world of Judge Dredd, again on paper at least, Britain, America, and pretty much all of the societies of the industrialized societies that I can think of off the top of my head, the police are part of a larger system. And so, in Judge Dredd, we're talking about the police making the system or being the sort of sole engineers of the system. But in real life, I think we have to be looking at, and ideally, Dredd, a satire, will deal with this too, the factors in society that make it still possible for the police to do what they're doing. Quite recently, it's come out that apparently schools in England are not allowed to share. Okay, so how schools in Britain are not allowed to teach material that is seen as promoting extremism, which in and of itself, fine, great. But the guidelines for what constitutes that kind of political extremism are, they keep getting, let's say, revamped to respond to current events. And the most recent revisions I have included in that definition of extremism is anything that's openly anti-capitalist, or that preaches that quote unquote preaches that capitalism is bad. And the problem is this can be quite, it leaves a lot of room for nebulous interpretation. They're not saying you shouldn't teach material that advocates violence. And even that, I think there is some wiggle room, but that would be a lot more defined than just material that says capitalism is bad, because that covers a lot. That covers various books of the Bible off the top of my head.
Yeah.
That covers are you not allowed to teach Karl Marx? Not saying that you all have to do exactly what Karl Marx, you all have to follow this exact model that Karl Marx has laid out, but are you allowed to teach that he said this from a neutral standpoint, not saying he said this, but he's wrong? Or are you allowed to just say, hey, this is what this guy thought, and some other people believe this, and here's what's happened, and here's how these ideas have been implemented successfully or not in some countries and societies. And that, seeing that what capitalism kind of upholds in Britain and in capital societies in general, that is, when you say anti-capitalist, you're talking about anti all those other systems, really, that capitalism allows to flourish. And if you look at America too, if you say, okay, anti-capitalist, what does capitalism allow to uphold? Basically, a lot of bad things that are happening in America right now. And if we're talking about societies that are trying to stop children from learning about this, or trying to say it's illegal for schools to talk about this, then that's part of what is allowing the Judge Dredd style policing, I think. And that needs to be taken into account, I would say.
You're basically not trusting the teachers or the students or the parents, anybody, to think for themselves to be able to
Yeah.
interpret these things in a way to make their own sense of it. Because if they do that, they start questioning the system in which they live. And if they do that, they start questioning the cops. And if they do that, then you start to want to unpack I am the law and what it means.
Right.
And who made you the law anyway? And what laws are these laws working for me or against me? And all of that, so it's like a domino effect. You see the same thing in the United States where, recently Donald Trump issued, I think, one of his bullshit executive orders about banning the teaching of critical race theory in schools.
Oh, I saw that. Yes, that was wild.
Yeah, that's one word for it.
It's anti-American, don't you know?
Yeah, and it's like, to talk about, how systemic racism has been part of the fabric of American society from its very inception, like to not engage with that idea at all, like just wants, again, it demands unquestioning loyalty to the myth that America tells us about itself, and not to investigate it at all. And that way lies authoritarianism. That's the calculus is pretty easy. That way lies Judge Dredd. That way lies Mega City 1. Trust us. We know what we're doing. Go back to your hovels and don't question why you don't have more or why other people have more and you have less, and obey the rules every time we change them. And don't ask why we're changing them either. Do all that stuff.
Funnily enough, pretty early on in the strip, there's a parade where there's like floats with judge escorts and all sorts. And one of them is a statue of a massive statue of a judge with a sword in one hand and a law book in the other. And at his feet there is an inscription that says "The Covenant of the Judges." And it's one of those wonderful moments of extreme satire. It's obviously meant to invoke the poem on the Statue of Liberty, which Dredd as a strip does a couple of times. But it literally trust in the judges. Submit to our authority and we will keep you safe. Now, this is one of the great ironies of the whole Judge Dredd strip, is if there's one thing that the people have not received at the hands of the judges, it is safety. I mean, the vast majority of them have perished in the most gruesome ways possible. And that's one thing I wanted to ask about was this kind of, as we see these narratives of law and order and chaos, of good and bad, and the binary choices of tribalism, does Judge Dredd become even more relevant? Is it more of a warning now than it's ever been? Silence.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like Joe Dredd has never been a guy that you could trust your individual personal safety towards, yeah, he might save your life, but ultimately,
But then you go to jail.
You go to jail, or your life doesn't get better. You may be alive, you may be amongst the living, but like the material kind of like realities of your life, like he doesn't really care about, and yeah, in the fiction, you're told that he has a higher cause to be concerned about, right? But like ultimately, this goes back to what Kelly was saying about capitalism and how it's taught and how people in power want it to be taught. Like it's again thinking about crime as a result of social inequities versus thinking about crime as being an activity inherent to certain social classes. And like as long as we keep thinking about things the one way versus the other way, I feel like that Dredd is a warning that's not being heeded, in my opinion.
There's a wonderful line from Richard Slotkin in his history of westerns and the notion of the frontier myth in the genre, where he's describing Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest, which is like one of the classics of hard-boiled detective fiction. And
Okay, many movies.
Exactly. And he says the justice which the detective achieves affects persons, not classes. It changes situations and does not transform orders. And that, for me, just so perfectly sums up Dredd. You know, he will bring justice in the moment, but he will not address the systematic reasons why that injustice exists in the first place. And that's a theme that has really, I think, come out. It was interesting that at the very beginning, Chloe mentioned about America, which of course is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year, and we've got various versions out. We've got the Essential Judge Dredd and the Lost and Found book, which looks back at John Wagner's original script.
Sell it, Mike.
It's my job. What am I going to do?
Can we buy it at all the retailers now?
It's relevant. But it's that kind of you get a story like that, which is very personal. It's very small. It's a micro story, and that's when you begin to see actually the effects of that kind of that system, where it's all very well to say that Dredd is a hero in a moment for one person, but actually, if you're not, as Evan says, if you're not that person, it doesn't work out so well, you know?
Yeah.
Well, even if you look at, I'm sorry, go ahead, Kelly.
Oh, no, go ahead. My thing's going to be super long.
Oh, okay.
I don't know, but
even with America Beanie as a character, right? As a judge, it's and then I lost it. She's kind of the perfect example of no good cops in a broken system, right? Because she goes into it and she says multiple times when she's really involved in the strip, like, the justice system needs to be changed. This is wrong. There are injustices. Citizens shouldn't be treated like this. And that's all well and good. But throughout the strip, what fucking change has she made? You know, she has, in fact, been very complicit in a lot of things, even if she hasn't been directly related to it. So even the best cops, and this can be said for Dirty Frank as well, but there can be, like, as much as we really want to believe that there are good cops, there are people that join police forces with good intentions who genuinely want to help their community and help support people. If they are in this system that is working against them, that is teaching them a warrior mentality, and that is actively fighting against proper change, then that good person, that good cop, is just going to get looped into this system where they also become corrupt. And so America in particular is extremely relevant right now.
It's that. No, I'm sorry, Kelly. I just, knowing full well that you wanted to speak, I went straight over the top of
No, it's okay. No, I was just gonna say that and America Beanie as this sort of, well, I mean, she's also the end, in a way that's incredibly bleak endpoint of satire. Because if you think about it, I mean, what is Benny? Like, what is his job? He's a comedy songwriter, but the first songs he makes up when he's a little kid, before he starts actually making big money, he makes up funny songs making fun of the judges. And as he gets older, you know, he kind of has these silly songs, and then he starts doing commercials, and, you know, forget about making fun of the judges. He actually says, you know, you could play by their rules and have a good life. That as long as you know, this guy who got started, he cut his teeth on satire and making fun of the judges, making fun of the oppression he was seeing around him. And what ends up happening is he ends up caving like everybody else. And what he does to America, you know, this woman that he's so obsessed with. I was going to say he's so in love with, he's not. He's just obsessed, and it's gross. To preserve her fight for freedom, he does kind of the creepiest thing you could possibly do, which is, you know, to show how much I really do care about the freedom that she was into, I'm going to have her body signed over to me. They didn't talk about this. She didn't say, by the way, if I die, please do this. It's because I'm rich. He even says it, when you're rich enough, anything can be arranged. So because he pays for her body, and he transplants his consciousness into her body, which again, they never talked about this. She never consented to this, but he does it. And he uses that to basically continue making money. And I mean, I guess the reason that comes to mind, besides that it's the 30th anniversary of America, is that's its own little cautionary tale, I think. To say, well, you know, this is where the satire of Judge Dredd can end up if you aren't careful. If the idea is to preserve the appearance of what you think you're doing, but not the actual core of it. I mean, literally by the end of it, America is dead. All it is a shell, and in later sequels, later sequels, as opposed to earlier sequels, no. But in sequels, I mean, America's body starts rejecting the transplant, and Benny has some sort of, in America's body, has this kind of basically like nervous system disorder. It's all horrible. Oh, and America Beanie is him and Ami's baby that he implanted.
It's a mess.
It's her. It's super, super disgusting. But the point is, I mean, like, when we say, is Judge Dredd still relevant? I think it's worth looking at America again and seeing what happened to Benny and making sure that doesn't happen to Judge Dredd the comic.
I mean, that's a very interesting point, because one of the issues that often comes up with Dredd is when he is received as a kind of Punisher-like figure, as an idealistic figure. The sheer number of tweets that we see through the accounts where people say, you know, we need Judge Dredd, all this, that, and the other, so they're kind of missing the one. But now he feels very much everything in Dredd is a comedic inversion. So everything small is made big, everything big is made small. The world is upside down, which is a very British way of satirizing the world. And what it feels like now is an inversion of the bad apple narrative. So when, particularly over the last few years, you see, well, you know, such and such who did this bad thing is a bad apple. Well, Dredd is an inversion of that, because he's meant to be a good apple in a barrel full of rotten apples. So the system is bad, but at least Judge Dredd is fine, and it's something that fundamentally the democracy storyline, which, you know, you can't really argue that it's that series. Well, that storyline hasn't been the backbone of the entire strip for 35, 40 years. For that to be coming around again and again and again, does that mean that sometimes the symbolism of Dredd can be too powerful for the satire it's trying to make? Can, in the words of Susan Sontag, beauty is fascism, or aesthetics is fascism. The symbol can become so loaded and bright that it can eclipse the satire it's trying to make.
He's got all the symbolism, like up and down, from even the little things in his eyes. He's definitely got all the symbolism there. I mean, I think the thing with Dredd is what he does, what the enjoyment of the comic is based on, at least in part, is him violently hurting people you see as bad. Like, even if you are enjoying it as a satire, you know, you are reading a thing that's sort of all about the violence and vengeance and, you know, this lizard brain stuff of, you know, here's something that's been done that's been wrong and it must be avenged. It's not even law, it's just cracking heads. And that, I think, is the thing that's on the surface that gets picked up by, as you say, a lot of these sort of tweet accounts where people are saying, we need Judge Dredd. A lot of people who just sort of, you know, maybe not even reading it, just know there's a guy called Judge Dredd who punches people and has a poster where he shouts, "I am the law." That all gets out there, even if the rest gets left behind. And yeah, that is worrisome. I am complicit in that, of course, because I'm sort of pumping out that product. I guess what I always sort of think is, am I making it worth it with the stories I'm telling? I like to think most of the time I am. There's, you know, enough of an element if you actually read them to know that it's not just about that lizard brain thing. But yeah, you're always going to have a problem where the surface of a thing is all that exists for people who experience it only on a surface level.
There's a small comic that somebody drew, and I can't remember for the life. I've been trying to remember who it was, but they did a comic, and it's, you know, Judge Dredd with looking all serious and stuff, and it's somebody saying "cool cop," and it's a bullet going over Dredd's head, but it says "the point." So, and I mean, that kind of sums it up. And most of the people, at least that I've run across, are all people that usually haven't really gotten into Judge Dredd at all, but are familiar enough with maybe the movie, or especially the Stallone movie for some reason. That's always the go-to, and I'm like, just stop. And
But it has Mean Machine. It has the angel guy in it. And I have respect for no reason.
but like, it's usually people that are not super familiar with the character, but like the iconography, and it doesn't help that most of them are kind of edgelords anyway. So, and you end up with people that want to identify with that hardened character who's here to save the day, and it's like, no, man, that's not what's happening here. Give it a rest.
The actual cops have all lodged onto, you know, the Punisher, who is a serial killer.
And who, okay, so, you know, the Punisher, Judge Dredd.
Kelly's
done got it started.
Here I come! But no, this is actually an interesting point, because so last night my husband and I were watching Hard Boiled, you know, the John Woo movie. And it's one of those movies where, there's a cop on a mission, and, you know, to complete the mission, he must just kill, like, an immense amount of people. But one thing they don't do in there is they don't kind of bang on about the code. There's a code, and we have to protect, blah, blah, blah. No, he just wants to get this guy. Oh, and, like, half the people in the gang that he's chasing are undercover cops, and nobody knows. Like, they don't know about each other, and so every time there's a new guy comes in, we're like, wait, is this guy also a secret cop? But I'm bringing this up because, you know, there is a way to do it, because that is, and also the movie's ridiculous. Like, every time anyone shoots anything, it blows up, and everyone's always crashing through windows, and you know, he can have a sort of your average handgun that somehow has infinite bullets. Yeah. And there it works, you know, it's not as disturbing because it's so fantastical. And I think, you know, with one thing Dredd and the Punisher maybe do share, at least for me, is this idea that they're fun to watch, but they would never not be fun to be. I mean, who is Dredd? Like, what does he like? He likes the law. That's it. You know, you want to be Judge Dredd? Cool. You're never going to get laid. You're never going to be able to really feel love. You're never really going to have friends that you just hang out with. You're never taking the helmet off. Yeah, you never take the helmet off, even when you're asleep. So probably he has a whole skin situation up here. You know, you're never going to be able to wear stuff to just go and wear the fun band t-shirt, the fun t-shirt you bought from Topatico or whatever. And with the Punisher, or at least the Garth Ennis take on it, is this is a man who has chosen the path he is taking, and to choose that path, something is really, really wrong with you. So cool, you want to be the Punisher? Okay, you never get to feel love again. You're so broken, you can never even really have friends again. Even if you think about having a family, you can't. There's no way you can have a functioning family unit. You could be really good at sex, but you're never going to fully enjoy it. And so I think in those contexts, it's like, cool, yeah, I can watch these guys do pretend violence, because that's they've paid this price already, whether they know it or not, to become these kind of violence machines. And I'm using that word very deliberately, that there's some essential part of them that isn't a person anymore. And, you think you want to be that person, but you really, to become that person, you have to you have to give up something really, really essential. And I think, most people, if they knew that, I don't know if they would.
And what's interesting about what you're saying, Kelly, is that I feel like, again, for the police authoritarian apologists, there is this thrill towards the complete lack of emotional and psychological processing that, again, these surface level readings of Dredd and Punisher present. Like Arthur was saying, is so much of the subversion doesn't make the journey into kind of a mainstream or political messaging adoption, right? So yeah, if all you know about the Punisher is that he shoots people without impunity. Same thing with Dredd.
He has a cool skull shirt.
Right? Yeah. Then yeah, you're gonna fetishize that, But if you know about the subversive kind of political commentary in Dredd stories, if you know that in Punisher stories that Frank really pretty much gave up on being happy for the mission, then maybe you wouldn't want that. But if all that makes it out is the black and white impunity and the kind of cool capacity for violence, then yeah, you're gonna put that bumper sticker on your car.
That ambiguity is there from the very beginning as well, and that's from John Wagner, because there's a wonderful interview you did years ago where he said, everyone's been in the moment of being cut up when they're driving and wanting Judge Dredd to come along and take that punk out. and that's an emotional thing. But but in that moment, what you're desiring is something without emotion to come and reset the scales of injustice that you feel in the moment. And I think that is a way that Dredd speaks to the now, which is that people are reacting and wanting something without any sense of bias, any sense of nuance or humanity or the liberal structure of our society to just come in and sort it, make it go away. It hurts. So go and hurt those people and it will stop hurting. They'll stop hurting me. And in that respect, that's one of the reasons why John Wagner is a genius, and Alan Grant too. That they created and crafted a character that managed to be those two things simultaneously, to have incredible nuance, and to be able to speak to a moment 40 years later in a fresh and interesting way. It's always interesting to see people come to Dredd now and actually read the stories like America, for them to go, wow, this is incredibly relevant. I kind of want to wrap things up here, because we've been chatting. We could probably keep going for hours, to be honest with you. But I just want to get your final thoughts on this, because the title is of the panel is satire and policing, and with everything that's going on, not just in the States, but around the world right now. Is Dredd a character? Is the satire implicit in Dredd as a character something that can create change, that can make things better? Or is comic books' role just to stand by the side and comment on what we see happening?
I think it very much, I think how you view Dredd as a piece of satire, as in a character that's meant to be satiric, I think has a lot to do with your relationship with the world and how you read those comics, and what your relationship is with that sort of authoritarianism. And it's one of those things, right, where, you know, certain things happen to you and you're able to have a dry, angry laugh about it later because of the weight of it. It's something that you can experience, and it's something that you can go, oh fuck, ha, and that's one way to tackle it. And I think that Dredd is certainly within that realm, but there's also kind of okay, I'm going to read this and I'm going to look at it like it is a proper warning and something to be afraid of because it's so familiar. But as far as it being a piece of satire, yeah, absolutely. I think that it holds up. It just very much depends on who you are and what your relationship is with figures like that in everyday life.
I think there's like the whole sort of like old communist era conception of writers as engineers of the human soul, and that doesn't really happen. People do what they can and want to with what you give them to get all death of the author. I mean, back when I was a kid and I used to watch Doctor Who, that was like the era where the Doctor Who writers were saying amongst themselves, we're totally going to bring down the Thatcher government with this. And they totally did not bring down the Thatcher government with this. But, you know, those stories definitely set up sort of like seeds in my head, which affect how I think now. So you can set up seeds with writing, but, you know, it's definitely a long stretch, and the results, you know, you can't really predict that. I try to put in good ingredients. Do with them what you will.
Yeah, I feel like if, you know, I mean, I don't know if this is about Judge Dredd specifically or how much this is about satire in general. But yeah, I agree with Arthur that if if Judge Dredd sets out to, I mean, the comic Judge Dredd sets out to bring, you know, we're going to bring down the government, or, you know, every time you see something on YouTube where, I don't know, John Oliver or whoever, like, eviscerate Donald Trump. Like, no, he didn't. He just said that, you know, no offense to John Oliver, he's just the first name that came up, but, you know, he just said that Donald Trump is stupid, and that's, you know, he's not bringing down the government by himself, but if someone is writing and they're just angry, and they can see a way to express that anger, you know, in a way that maybe that's sharp, maybe that's funny, maybe that just worms its way into people's heads. Maybe that doesn't bring down the government right away, but it maybe gets people thinking about the larger causes and systems that allow whatever government to exist and to function. And then who knows? You get enough people thinking, and then the governments that come up, maybe they're different. Maybe not, but maybe then more people are angry about that, and, you know, something can happen, I think. But there needs to be that sort of flipping the tables in the temple moment. You can't stand back and just sort of chuckle wryly, because that just feels hollow. I think there needs to be that anger.
I guess I'm going last. And I just want to say, Mike getting increasingly darker is a nice metaphor for,
Yeah.
for this panel at our times. But I think there's still the capacity and the need and the desire for satire to come through a vessel like Dredd, right? Like, he's ripe for that kind of commentary. And I think it's come up several times during this panel. Was conceived as such, right? He was conceived as a vessel for satirical thematic delivery. But I think what creates this interesting tension is that like the conventions of the world in which he operates inherently limits like his capacity to be a vehicle for that kind of messaging, right? So like, at the end of the day, Dredd kind of sort of still has to be in the right, and I use that phrase in all possible ways. He still has to kind of be mostly on a good guy, right? And he still has to, like we were saying before, deliver justice. He can't. He's not a great vehicle. I shouldn't say not great. In skilled hands, he probably can be a vehicle to indict the very system in which he operates in, and the real life kind of avatars of his ethos. But it'd be very hard to do that, like we've been saying, like even if somebody like Dredd recognizes that the ultimate evil is something he takes part in perpetuating in, he's not going to be a burn it all down guy. He's like, well, this is the cost we pay, right? He's going to be that guy. He's going to be an apologist, even if he realizes that the system, there's an injustice inherent to the system in which he operates. Like I said, there's like an interesting tension to that. And you can use that as a springboard for satire, I think. But I feel like inherently Dredd is hamstrung in some foundational ways.
Of course, there's the wonderful moment with Origins and the Tour of Duty, where he tries to change the system a little bit and the system fundamentally breaks, which is a hell of a comment on reform. Well, I've taken up far too much of your time, so thank you to you all for what has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Cheers, and here's hoping that Judge Dredd isn't in our future.
Great stuff. Thank you so much to Evan, Chloe, Kelly, and Arthur for taking part in that panel. Great to chew these things over. Judge Dredd is just one of those characters. It's kind of hard to overstate how prescient and how relevant he continues to be as a character, as not just John Wagner, but also other writers sort of explore the themes inherent in him and his world. So thank you very much indeed for joining us on this latest episode of the Thrillcast. Again, if you have any suggestions, do drop us a line, give us a review if you're enjoying the lockdown tapes, and also give us a share on social media and help spread the word about the glory of thrill power. As always, I hope you're staying safe. Things are taking a bit of a downward turn again, so I hope everyone is all safe and well. In the meantime, and until next time, look after yourselves, look after one another, and splendid Verthwig.
Alert! 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 Thrill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000adonline.com.